Hello, welcome and good evening. Thank you for joining us. It's Friday night and we're still studying Burgundy. What better thing to do in New York on a Friday evening but to delve further into a region that brings so much complexity, so much joy to study, to begin to understand, so many opportunities to taste and explore wine. We're coming to a close on sort of the first of our Burgundy series. We'll be talking about Puligny-Montrachet tonight and Chassagne-Montrachet next week. And that will kind of be the close of our first two series on the Côte Nuit and Côte Beaune, but we may pick up on some of these smaller villages a little bit later on in the year. It's been really fascinating to put together these presentations and to delve into understanding the complexities and the nuances of these different villages. We are not experts of Burgundy, and I think I've made that clear in some of our previous classes, but we do a lot of studying, and I think it really helped to contextualize what we hear about some of these vineyards, the styles that we might expect from these individual villages and these individual vineyard sites, and why throughout history they've become so incredibly important, right? And what I really hope is that you don't come away from this obviously knowing everything there is about Burgundy, because that is a lifelong pursuit. As I say all the time, if you are the type of person that has to know everything about a particular subject, then Burgundy might not be for you. But if you want to have your whole life to try, then it might actually be the place to learn and understand. So I think that can be really fun. But what we really hope for you is that we sort of bring the opportunity to light for you to understand how you might want to focus your own studies if you do decide to delve further into Burgundy. So what we have been doing is we've been sending some resources that we have really enjoyed to prepare for these classes out when we send the follow-up notes and the recording. The slides that we put together are quite dense. And the reason for that is not because we want to overwhelm or because we think it's necessarily important within these presentations of an hour to go into how many hectares each individual vineyard site or lieu-dits of a village is. The point of it is because we do transcribe this information to an outline for you, so that not only do you have this class as reference to kind of bring some of these ideas to the surface, to focus the understanding of these particular villages, but so that you have that reference to go back to when you do want to cross-check something, when you are thinking about whether you're going to invest in Chevalier-Montrachet, Bertard-Montrachet, or Bienvenue, Bertard-Montrachet, right? And you might be like, I want to invest in one of these. Which one should I invest in if I'm looking for something a little bit more floral and fresher on the lighter and more mineral side? Or which one do I want to invest in if we're looking for something on the richer, bolder, more intense, broader mouthfeel side, right? So we're going to skip a lot of the sort of Burgundy intro today. We'll send out a copy of our Burgundy Basics recording. I sent it out with the link for tonight's class, and I'll also send it out with the follow-up tomorrow so that you can go back and review that if you'd like. It's an hour-long recording, just like this will be as well. So we'll kind of work in a little bit of the history of Burgundy, because you always have to when it comes to talking about these vineyards, but we're going to skip a little bit of the lay of the land and the law. But please let me know if you have any questions and review that other recording if you do as well. So we're looking overall at a map of the major wine regions of France. So this one is a little bit more pared down. It doesn't have all of the wine regions here that we talk about, but you can see Champagne in the north. You can see Alsace over here between the Vosges Mountains and the Rhine River. The Rhone Valley stretching from just south of Burgundy, from Beaujolais, all the way down to the Mediterranean, Loire, Bordeaux. But of course, today we're talking about Burgundy. Burgundy starts up here. with the region of Chablis right next to Champagne. But we're focusing in this series on the villages of the Côte d'Or, or the Golden Slope. And we're focused today on an area, kind of the southern part of the Côte d'Or, known as the Côte des Beaunes. Now, the Côte des Beaunes is renowned for its white wines. The northern part of the Côte d'Or is renowned for its red wine, which we've covered as well. So let's sort of spotlight in, right? Let's begin to take a look at where we're heading with these particular villages, right? So we just looked at an overall map of France. Now we're looking at the Côte des Beaunes, so the southern sector of the Côte d'Or in the region of Burgundy. Now, as I mentioned before, it's renowned for the quality, the complexity of its white wines. But in the Côte des Beaunes, we do produce a lot of red as well. There are most of the Grand Cru vineyards that are located within the Côte des Beaunes produce only white wine. There's only one, which is Corton here in the north, covered a few weeks ago by my colleague Ryan, that is allowed to produce both white and red wine. So all of the Grand Cru vineyards that we'll be discussing today do produce white wine only. Can you grow Pinot Noir in the Grand Cru vineyard? Yes, you can. Can you label it as Grand Cru? No, you can't. That wine will have to be declassified. And understanding the concept of declassifying wine in Puligny, in the village of Puligny, is really important. And we'll get to that in just a moment. So let's take just kind of a look at the village and the vineyards and how they're classified and where they're at within the village of Puligny, within the boundaries, right? So you can see that the kind of light orange peach color are the Grands Crus. Montrachet is the Grand Cru of Grand Crus. We're going to get into this in a second, but let's just say it's kind of like the Hope Diamond, right, of Chardonnay vineyards, and it's encrusted in this crown of jewels that are the other Grand Cru vineyards around it, all of which have appended the name of the best vineyard, which is the Grand Cru of Montrachet, to their own name. So very similar to what we see in Gevrey, further north with Chambertin in the Côte Nuit. The green color are our Premier Cru vineyards. Now, what's really unique about the village of Puligny is that not all of our Premier Cru vineyards abut a Grand Cru. This is very common in terms of how the vineyards are positioned on the slope in other parts of Burgundy. But here you can see that we have a few that abut the Premier Cru, Cailleret and Pucelles. We'll talk about Demoiselle as well when we get to that. But most of them stretch between the Grand Cru de Puligny to the Premier Crus of Meursault, which you should have heard about last week. So we see this stretch of Premier Crus here in the green. Take note of a few of the blue spaces that we have that are actually village level wine, right? And then down here surrounding the village, you do have the village level lieu-dits or village level wine, meaning you can take grapes from any of these single vineyards and label it as, for example, a Vaulx Les Boudoirs village level Puligny wine. You can blend grapes from all of these lieu-dits and release it as just a Puligny village level wine, meaning you won't put the individual name of a lieu-dit on it. With the Premier Cru, you can do the same thing. We can release, Premier Cru Les Verfert, or we can blend multiple Premier Crus and we can list that as just a Premier Cru wine of Puligny without the individual Premier Cru vineyard on it. We cannot blend Grand Cru vineyards and list it as just Puligny Grand Cru. It must have the name of the Grand Cru vineyard and the grapes must only come from that individual vineyard itself. Up here we have the hamlet of Blagny, and we'll discuss this in a bit. They do release 3 of the 7 Premier Crus within Blagny. 4 belong to Meursault and are released as Premier Cru Meursault, and 4 belong to Puligny and are released as Premier Cru Puligny, which we'll also get to a little bit later on. I oftentimes get ahead of myself and then sort of like discuss everything that's in an upcoming slide before we get to it, and then I get to the slide and I'm like, well, I have nothing to tell you. I told you already. So let's try not to do that tonight. Stay focused. So let's talk about Puligny-Montrachet. Puligny, the village itself, and appended, I think it was 1786, when it appended the name of its best vineyard, which is Montrachet, to its own name. So there's a village next door to Puligny called Chassagne, and shortly after Puligny appended the name of the best vineyard, Chassagne also appended the name of their best vineyard, which was also Montrachet. So we're going to talk about Chassagne next week, and you'll hear some of the same information because Chassagne and Puligny share two Grand Cru vineyards. They share Montrachet and Montrachet. So we'll talk about the producers that are in each area, and then we'll talk about, of course, the separate Premier Crus, the separate Grand Crus that they do have, and the village lieu-dits as well. This is incorrect, 1979. I think that's supposed to say 1879, my mistake. But for many critics, Puligny-Montrachet stands to be the highest on the white Burgundy podium. Clive Coates, who is an MW, called it the greatest white wine commune on earth. Rajat Par says that if Burgundy was a poker game, that Puligny got dealt a royal flush. The vineyard of Montrachet and the surrounding Grand Cru vineyards around it. All of the surrounding Grand Crus of Montrachet kind of bask in this reflected radiance of the Grand Cru vineyard itself. And it really, what's so fascinating is this unique quality that the Grand Crus of Puligny have to subtly shift the balance of power and finesse. So these are very, very complete wines, and we'll get to that in a moment as well. Reds are allowed in the village of Puligny. They're allowed at the village and the Premier Cru level, but not at the Grand Cru level. However, Puligny might be the closest thing to a pure white wine village in the entire Côte d'Or. Since, 2012, the last time I saw these figures available, only 35 hectoliters were declared of red wine from 11,000 hectoliters. So, it's something around such a small percentage, right? 1%, 0.5%. There's a higher water table in Puligny than we have in Meursault. Because of that, most of the cellars are above ground rather than underground, like we see in Meursault. And also the wines tend to be aged a little bit less. Now, not all wines, and especially the Premier Cru and Grand Cru, can sometimes be aged for longer, but just keep that in mind. Now, the conditions of the vineyard and the soil shift very quickly in Puligny as well, by comparison to some of these other areas. Now that's because as we get closer to the village, we have a pretty flat slope. Now the slopes are very mild within Puligny as it is. Certainly as we get towards the top of the slope, places like Chevalier and Blagny, we see a little bit more of that influence. But as we get down towards the village on the flatter slope, we have a lot more clay. The water table's a lot higher, and there's issues closer to the village with the village level wine of excess production because of the water, because of those heavier clay soils, and issues with frost as well. We kind of have this fog that sort of hovers and stays within these little dips in the vineyard and frost as well. That doesn't mean that Puligny did not make good village level wine, but although many of the Premier Crus deserve top billing, are also considered to be some of the best in Burgundy as well. Overall, we like to say that Village Puligny is rarely as good as the best Village Meursault. Now, I also want to add to that as well, of course, is what do we always say about Burgundy? Producer over anything else. And that's why we do these deep dive classes, because we're talking already about the concept of declassifying wine, right? So remember, when you see a term of Burgundy, an appellation on a bottle of Burgundy wine, that is the lowest level of what can be in the bottle. Now, there can be fruit from a higher quality level of vineyard in that bottle as well, but maybe they blended in just a little bit of village level wine with a declassified Premier level wine, right? Maybe they blended in a little bit of Premier Cru level wine with a declassified Montrachet. Now that wouldn't make sense unless you had young vines or a really poor vintage, but you get the concept. So we're going to talk about those producers that are more or less declassifying Premier Cru and selling it as village level Puligny, right? Now, this is also a great village to look at Premier Crus because the majority of them are mid-sized. We're talking, 5-6 hectares. Some of them are smaller, but this makes the availability of Premier Cru Puligny more accessible for the average person. Now, we're going to talk about the Grand Crus, of course. We're going to talk about the Premier Crus, but sometimes it becomes a little difficult, especially at the Grand Cru level, that we sit and we talk about Burgundy, Grand Cru, when so few of us actually get to drink it. And that's definitely true within Puligny, especially for the Grand Cru. These are very sought after. The wines are rare, the production is minuscule, and they are very, very expensive. There is no such thing as inexpensive Montrachet. If somebody offered you that, run. Alan Meadows always likes to say, I want to say it correctly, he says, you might, when it comes to Burgundy, you might not always get what you pay for, but you'll never get what you don't pay for, is what he likes to say. So what makes Puligny so special? So they like to say that, Puligny and Burgundy experts that I look up to, they like to say that Puligny really has a sense of breed and a sense of class. Does this come from the climate and the soils within this particular village? It probably does. It's probably a combination. And it has this steely background, sort of this backbone of minerality to the wine. It's a little bit finer than what we find in Meursault or Chassagne. And when I say finer, I don't mean lighter. The thing about Puligny is that I mentioned before, the wines are known for their incredible completeness. They're rich while still mineral. They're fruity while still taut, right? They have this backbone, but they have this fleshiness to them as well. They really have everything that you could possibly want in a white wine, the most complete white wine in the world. We talked about the Premier Crus. Many of them start from the edge of the Grand Cru towards Meursault, as you saw. Demoiselles, Cailleret, and Pucelle command the top prices, followed by Champconnet, Refert, Perrier, and Clavillon. Les Combettes on the Meursault border shows a lot of that plumpness. And then upslope, we can think of those Premier Crus as being a little bit lighter. They have less intensity and complexity, but are still beautiful wines. They just have lighter soils and a slightly cooler climate that gives us a little bit less strength and opulence and power within the wines themselves and the grapes that are grown there, of course. I do kind of like to think of the Premier Crus as sort of splitting them into sections, right? We can think of the upper slope Premier Crus. We can think of the ones that abut Meursault, and then we can think of the ones that sort of abut or almost abut the Grand Crus, because not all of them do. So let's talk about some of those. It's always helpful to have some maps here. I was trying to find some larger pictures like this that I could show for you, but I couldn't find a lot. But I really like this one that shows a lot of these soils. So you can kind of see, we'll talk about Cailleret and Chevalier. We'll talk about these really fine kind of stony, pebbly soils that you can see here, even though we have Pinot Noir planted. You can see the slope of the hillside, Bienvenue and Batard-Montrachet on more of the flatter land, just slightly sloping hillside here. We move to Montrachet higher up on the slope. And there's also a shift in the fault line here. So Chevalier-Montrachet is actually on a different fault than we find Montrachet, Batard, and Bienvenue as well. And we're going to abbreviate a lot, right? We're not going to say Bienvenue, Batard-Montrachet every time, or Batard-Montrachet, or Chevalier-Montrachet every time. We'll say Batard, we'll say Bienvenue, and we'll say Chevalier. And we are discussing the Grand Cru themselves. And of course, Montrachet will just be called Montrachet. Just like the top chef in a restaurant in New York, right? You don't call them chef by their name. You don't call them by their name. They're just chef. Montrachet is Montrachet. But we do have this oolitic limestone as we move to Chevalier, and it's more on the same kind of fault plate as what we see actually in more of the Côte Nuit. So I think that's really interesting. So Batard, you can see the sort of iron-rich soils here. We have a lot more clay and marl. Montrachet further up the slope, and then Chevalier the highest up on the slope. And Chevalier is actually terraced, which is really interesting because that's something you very rarely see in Burgundy itself as well. So let's discuss some of the village lieu-dits. Now, lieu-dit, of course, we know is a named parcel of land. The name is really there for taxation purposes, but we really appropriated it for listing the purpose of terroir in Burgundy and listing these individual parcels if we are using grapes from a single parcel on a label of wine. So these are all village level wines that we're looking at right now. Les Charmes, located on the north side, does abut the Merceau Premier Cru Les Charmes, but it is a village level wine. How will you know the difference? One, it will say Puligny-Montrachet instead of Merceau, right? And it will not have the term Premier Cru either listed spelled out as Premier Cru or as 1ER Cru listed on the label for Puligny. That's how we're going to know the difference. It does have the advantage of sounding as if it's a Premier Cru. Now, anytime you hear charm in Burgundy, there's a lot of vineyards called charm. Usually it's a reference to maybe a little bit more of the openness of the wine. It might be available a little bit more in its youth. It probably has maybe a more open charm to it. And we oftentimes think of these wines and these vineyards as being this way. We think of it in Merceau. We think of it in places like Chambertin and Gevrey, right? Main producers in Charm are two brothers took over their father's holding, Alain and Jean-Louis Chavy. We also have Corvée des Vignes, one of the lower laying Puligny vineyards that's just east. Look south on this map, but you think we're going north. It's this way, right? So just east of Les Charmes. And we have Jean-Marc Vincent, Philippe Chavy, Gaffois, Most Lavac are all important producers coming out of this that are actually making this lieu-dit style wine. Les Insinières is probably, I would say, one of the best village level wine. So it's the most common that you might see as listed as its own lieu-dit. It's just below Batard and Bienvenue, Montrachet, Bienvenue, Batard, Montrachet. We have Côte de Riz is here, coming out of Merceau. Ramonet from Chassagne is here. Vincent Garradine again, Olivier Leflevre, who we're going to talk about. Olivier Leflevre is a negociant, but he is the cousin to Anne-Claude Leflevre and the Leflevre dynasty, located in Puligny-Montrachet as well. And this is also a lieu-dit who does provide the bulk of Henri Boyot's village level Puligny as well. So if you see the Insinière, or if you see Henri Boyot's village Puligny, it's coming from this village vineyard that's actually abutting two of the Grands Crus. So another one of those important Burgundy tips. Les Grands Champs includes Les Petits Grands Champs, but it's low-lying, it's a little bit damp. The only producer to actually offer this particular vineyard right now is Bernard Bachelet. So Les Levrons, Noiseroy, Noyer-Bret, Bretchot, we're all talking about village level vineyards here as well. Levrons located on the Merceau side of the village, just below the Premier Cru of Refert. So you can see this. So you can see my little hearts on each of these areas. I think it's lots of fun. Genot Boulanger is located here. They're a really fantastic producer. Genot Boulanger, I like them because their wines, I think, are priced accessibly. Did that make them cheap? No, it doesn't. But they produce wine in, I think over 30 communes in Burgundy, and they do a really great job. The vineyard itself is located in the Côte Nui, but I would call them a kind of like a top level producer that has holdings in many of the different villages within Burgundy. Bituzet-Prieur, Hubert-Chavy, Havilliers is here as well. And Noce-Royer, well placed just below the Premier Cru of Perrier. This is the backbone of Leflevre village level Puligny. So they don't actually make it into their own cuvée. They do blend it into their village level. But again, one of those village vineyards that actually abut one of the Premier Crus. So you might think that the quality here can be a little bit higher as well. Genot Boulanger is also here. Noyer-Brett, a little bit on the lower slope, just 2 producers coming from Chassagne for this particular vineyard. And Rochot is right at the bottom of the village. But we have a couple of producers, one Chanzy coming from Bouzeron and Boyer-Martineau coming out of Merceau, that's producing a single lieu-dit, bottling of this particular wine. Rue Rousseau, Philippe Chavy, we're going to talk, Philippe Chavy, cousin to Elaine and his brother. Les Tremblots, next to Chassagne, Hubert Lamy is a really notable producer in this particular lieu-dit. And Les Trézines is actually really quite fantastic. It's the only village Puligny vineyard that's located at the top of the slope. So aside from these kind of smaller declassified parcels that we're going to discuss, Les Trézines is up here located in the hamlet of Blagny. So this style can be very long-lived, really fine bone, definitely more on the mineral side of the village lieu-dit as well. Not down here on the flatter land with the heavier clay soils higher up on the slope. Let's talk about some Premier Crus. We're all here to drink Premier Cru and Grand Cru Puligny. Am I right? So, Puligny is actually I think this is, maybe one of the easier classes because it's actually a pretty easy village to understand, right? When you look at this map, it's not like some of the other villages where you have Grand Crus at one end and then at the other end, or you have 9 Grand Crus in a single village, or you have 20 something Premier Crus and village level vineyards that are spread out all over the place. Like they're really in kind of these neat little blocks. And also, even though we have 17 Premier Crus, so there's something like 13 main Premier Crus in Puligny, but many of them actually have an enclave or is an enclave of the larger Premier Cru. So it's actually a great segue to Les Demoiselles, which is an enclave within the Premier Cru of Les Caillerets. So it is highly sought after. It's of exceptional quality. Amiot, Philippe Colline, and Colline Deslegers are producers that you will find within Les Demoiselles. It's only barely over half a hectare, so quite small. And it's just the last rows of vines located within the Premier Cru of Caillerets. So this area here, we're going to look at a zoom in on a map in a second, before you get to the Grand Cru of Montrachet. Les Caillerets, almost 4 hectares, that includes that 0.6 hectares of Demoiselles. It's a continuation of Montrachet to the north, but it doesn't have quite the same exposure. It is very, very stony. It's not, it has a little bit more topsoil than Chevalier does right above it, as you can see. So Montrachet, Chevalier, Montrachet on the hill, right? Cailleret here. And it used to be a monopole of Domaine John Chartron, who was the principal owner, but he was forced to sell some of his plots due to some inheritance issues, which is, really unfortunate. He makes really fantastic styles of wine. And fortunately, when he was forced to sell, he sold to a couple of really fantastic producers, including Monty, who we're going to enjoy tonight, and the Claude Lambray. So Hubert de Monty is one of my favorite producers in Burgundy. I love everything that they do. And this is a Premier Cru where you still find Pinot Noir as well. It was actually planted as late as 1956 in Clos du Cailleret, which is an enclosed part of Cailleret. The wine from Clos du Cailleret is made by John Chartron. But most of the Pinot Noir in Cailleret had been replaced with Chardonnay at this point. I mean, I'm sure we'll continue to see that. Why is Puligny, we have this like sea, even in the Côte du Beaune, we have this sea of like red wine from Corton, where you have a lot of white, but you have this sea of just red wine, right, down to Merceau. So how do we get to these 3 villages that are the epitome of Chardonnay, right? We do have a little bit more clay here. The Chardonnay grape really prefers more of those marl soils, where the limestone needs more of that, the Pinot Noir needs a little bit more of that active limestone to keep that pep and minerality that it really has, that electrifying lightning palate, right? But Jean Chartrand does still produce very small amounts of Puligny-Montrachet Premier Cru Rouge coming out of Caillaret. I don't think he labeled it as Caillaret. I think he just labeled it as Puligny-Montrachet Premier Cru. So he might be getting some grapes occasionally to supplement. And I would imagine that he would, because I don't think we're going to probably keep Pinot Noir and Caillaret. You know, once, maybe you won't rip it out just because, but maybe once those vines need to be replanted, they'll probably go to Chardonnay. Les Pucelles, the maiden, fits into the folklore of the Puligny Grand Cru, which we're going to be talking about. It's kind of the quintessential Puligny at the Premier Cru level. Stylistically, it's quite close to Bienvenue, as it is next door as well. Top producers are Leflevre, Chartrand, Alain Chevy, Marc Moret, Moret Coffinet, and Paul Pernot. I've had the Paul Pernot, the Leflevre wines, and they're all really fantastic. So we're going to be talking about Les Demoiselles a few times, and I want to start by pointing it out on this map. So we're looking at the vineyards themselves, Google Earth, and you can see the outlines of the vineyards. So Chevalier up here on the slope with the terraces, Montrachet. This is Les Demoiselles Premier Cru, the part of Les Caillaret. There's also a Chevalier Montrachet, Les Demoiselles, that's bottled by Louis Latour and Louis Jadot. And that is this parcel just above. So one is Premier Cru and the other is actually Grand Cru, which we'll get into. You can see Pucelles bordering Batard, Bienvenue, and then we're going to talk in a moment about Clavaillon as well. Really important, Clavaillon, for Domaine Leflevre, which I think I would say if you have to remember any Puligny producer, it should be Leflevre. I think that they're really the quintessential producer. They make wine in all of the Puligny Grand Crus, so really incredibly important here. So you can see the Jean Chartrand plot located within Caillaret. He sold to Delambre. He sold to Domaine des Montis. You can see these larger plots. Domaine de la Pousse d'Or, also a really fantastic producer that's often overlooked. I think they just don't, for whatever reason, don't necessarily have the same prestige, but Gerard Portel, who made the wine for a very long time, was a great mentor to many of the finest producers in Burgundy today. Up here, you can see Chevalier Montrachet. This is the section that's labeled by Jadot and Latour as Chevalier Montrachet Les Demoiselles. So this is a Grand Cru section. And then we have what's this, a little bit of declassified land. And then we have another small section of Chevalier Montrachet Grand Cru as well. Clos de Mex enclave within La Pucelle. It's not bottled under its own name currently. So you can see this on this map right down here, just to the left of the heart. So Leflevre is the principal holder here, but currently they don't separate out the fruit from this kind of enclave that could technically be listed under its own name. They include it with the rest of their fruit from Pucelle and they label it as Premier Cru Pucelle. I don't know why they do that. Maybe the vines are a little bit younger. Maybe they don't think that it makes a complete wine, but you might consider that that's something that they could do in the future, is separate that fruit out and sell it as its own Premier Cru. Clavaillon, if we go to the right of Les Pucelles, is an incredibly ideally situated vineyard, faces due east just below the mid-slope. But because it's just below the mid-slope, we do have heavier soil than we see with the neighbors. So it was planted a lot for red wines up until phylloxera, and the vineyard laid fallow for quite some time. It wasn't actually replanted until well into the 20th century. And today it's nearly a monopole of Leflevre. And what's really fascinating, we're going to talk about Leflevre, is they are fully biodynamic today. And Claude Leflevre did a lot of experimentation in the 90s with both organics and biodynamics. And their large site in Clavaillon was really the first place that they started working with all these kind of newer and different styles of treating the vines in the vineyard as well. So it worked for them, fully biodynamic. I always think of, I'm always like Leflevre, Lafon are really kind of the biodynamic instigators within the Côte de Beaune as well. Folatier, the largest Premier Cru. So you'll see quite a bit of this because it's going to be available. It includes these smaller enclaves and Premier Crus that can be listed in tandem on the label in La Richarde, Puy-Bois, and Haut-Chagnon. And the lower rectangle known as Haut-Chagnon is on the same contour as well as Montrachet and Cailleret. So you can actually see, so Folatier is quite large up here, also a smaller declassified area. And we're going to talk about that now, actually. And then you see Chagnon, which is on the same line as Cailleret. So it's known as Folatier, kind of the crazy earth. The earth from the upper part of the vineyard does come tumbling down, this sort of violent form of erosion during the heavy rain. And these kind of also in the lower part, these sort of wisps of fog collect and sort of resemble these ghostly forms. But this erosion from the top of the slope actually improves with the poorer soil, improves some of the drainage on the bottom slopes as well. So Chevalier, Montrachet, Cailleret, and Montrachet have really fantastic drainage because of these sort of small stones in the vineyards, right? Now we see this declassified parcel right in the middle of Folatier, right? Like, why is that there? Why wasn't this part included? Well, it was included in the Premier Cru, but it was declassified to village level after owners brought in topsoil from elsewhere. This has happened in a few places. So this also happened in La Richarde, we're going to talk about in a second. And it also happened over here in Chalamu. So keep that in mind. These are 3 places where producers said, I'm going to bring in topsoil from somewhere else when they replanted their vineyard, and they lost the status that their vineyard had because they changed the character of the earth itself. Benoit Ent, Etienne Sauzet, Louis Jadot, and Bachelet Monod are all fantastic producers here. Sauzet is located here. Bachelet Monod is located further south in Morange. But keep in mind, of course, that Burgundy is not very big. It's not hard for producers to purchase a few rows of vines when they come for sale in a neighboring village and make the wine from them there. Champagne, much higher up on the slope, much closer to Blagny. Very thin, scrubby soil, being reclaimed more from the forest above. It's very arid here. When we have these thinner soils, they can suffer quite a bit if we have really intense drought. In warmer years, they can do better, right? Because we still maintain more of that minerality and freshness in the wine. But if we have severe drought, we're thinking of maybe some of these higher slopes not doing as well because of the really thin soil and their inability to retain more moisture. Carillon is here, Francois Carillon, the son of Louis. Both of the Chavy brothers are here, Gerdine, Dominique Lafon, coming from Merceau, Maroslavic, and Olivier Leflevre. La Truffier, where the truffles grow, just kind of to the northeast of Champagne. Non-contiguous parcels, as you can see here, very fine-boned and really talented producers. So not a lot of wine made from here, under 3 hectares, but Jean-Marc Boyot and Benoit Ent are both doing really fantastic things with the grapes that they have here. Claude La Garenne should not be confused with La Garenne, the other Premier Cru that we're going to talk about. Instead, Claude La Garenne is part of Champagne, a little bit more to the north here. So Roland Thevenin, the mayor of Saint-Romain at some point, I think maybe 10 years ago, or I'm not sure when he was the mayor, but previously a mayor of Saint-Romain. And he owned a significant part of this vineyard, but he sold it to the Duc de Magenta. And the Duc de Magenta is a very important family in Puligny, and the properties that they own are managed and distributed by Jadot. Jadot had a really big influence in Puligny-Montrachet. They also own a lot of, even though they're a negociant, they own a lot of their own vineyard parcels within the Grands Crus as well. Paul Pernod has a small plot here, but he sells his grape to Drouin. I would imagine that that's probably a previous sharecropping agreement. And oftentimes what happens in Burgundy is growers pass away, their children take over the land, and that land is contracted to a larger negotiant house. They have to sell the fruit to them. But when these contracts are up, a lot of these younger growers are taking back these contracted lands that their family owned and beginning to make their own wine from them. So this is how you see producers that are suddenly making wines from vineyards and spots that they weren't maybe making before. Perrier, not located next to the Meursault vineyard of the same name. We talk about the name comes from stone quarries. The remnants of these still exist. They show a lot of fresh minerality and tension. Boyau is here, and Jacques Carillon, one of the main producers. Clos de la Mouchère, it was located within Les Perriers. So this 4 hectares is included in the 8.4 hectares of Perrier that we see. This is a monopoly of Henri Boyau. Within Perrier, it's on the Clairvallon side. The land was purchased in 1934. It had been fallow since phylloxera, and it was planted in those following years. So planted in the 1930s, it's never been replanted since. And Henri says it really produces a very singular style of wine, this monopole. It's richer, it's more honeyed than the wine that he gets out of his other sites in Perrier. He really wants to study a lot more about the topsoil when the vineyard does need replanting. So he's looking forward to learning more about that as well. Les Referts, also located on the Meursault side, more marl mixed into the clay and the limestone. It's a relatively fuller bodied wine for Puligny, and it ages really well also. We see a lot of producers that are coming over from Meursault producing wine within Referts because, of course, of its proximity, but also because of that sort of similar soil type, that fuller, more powerful bodied wine, the concentration that we do see here. Arnaud Ant and Benoit Ant, they're brothers. Arnaud make wine in Meursault as well. Etienne Sauzet, PYCM, Pierre-Yves Colline Moret is his winery. His name is Pierre-Yves Colline. Bachelet Monod is here. The old Louis Carillon estate, which his son split up as well. Les Combettes, Etienne Sauzet, Etienne Sauzet, Etienne Sauzet. One of his finest wines that he produces. Le Fleuve, Carillon are both here as well. Jacques Prieur, another producer who owns a lot of land in many different appellations within Burgundy as well. Just across the border from Meursault, Perrier, and Charme, it shares more of the plumpness of Meursault, but it still retains the more of the refinement and that mineral elegance that you see in Puligny. Champconnet, just above Combette and south of Perrier itself. So here we're seeing right over here alongside the heart. I'm going to move up to Lake Chalumeau in a second, which is fun to talk about. 2 non-contiguous sectors, Clos de la Garenne, which we talked about, not the same as La Garenne, which we're going to discuss. La Jacalote, another separate lieu-dits that can be labeled under its own name here, but it's not. Had 2 owners, the Pernod and the Carillon. They choose to label it as Champconnet, but again, that might change in the future. A little bit further up on the slope, so we do see more of that freshness as opposed to that power, sort of the elegance and the charm, but it does still have a little bit more body than the more upslope neighbors in Blagny. Chalumeau, this section that you see here was confiscated and declassified. It was previously part of the Premier Cru, but again, the previous owners brought in topsoil from somewhere else in 1977. And that altered its character. So the parcel now belongs to Chateau de Puligny, and it's the backbone of their village cuvée. Now, Chateau de Puligny now belongs to the Desmontis family. The chalumeau is a medieval musical wind instrument, and there's an upper subsection of just about a hectare and a half known as Soulé-Courtil, also not bottled under its own name, but we might see it in the future. And these wines are a little bit softer and more forward in their use as well. So the Blagny Premier Crus, we mentioned before, the hamlet within the Puligny-Montrachet commune. It's located on the higher slopes that are north of town, as you can see here. The vineyards are technically divided between Puligny and Meursault, and the 3 Premier Crus on the Puligny side, 4 Premier Crus on the Meursault side, and they label their wines as the better regarded, better known appellations. You can label your wines as Blagny, but because they're allowed to label it Puligny and Meursault, they're better known than Blagny is. So you have these three on the Puligny side, Hameau de Blagny, Lagaren, which is not the same as Clos de Lagaren. Higher up on the slope, the wines are more finesse, less weighty. Louis Jadot makes great wines here. And Sous les Puits talks about a well or a spring that burst out of the rock above the vineyard in earlier times. And this is actually unique because it's one of the highest elevation vineyards in the entire Côte d'Or. So kind of a unique, we don't, it's like we talk about elevation everywhere in the world of wine, except in Burgundy, right? We don't really have a lot of elevation. We're not talking about these super steep hillsides like the Douro or the Moselle. These are really gentle slopes. And then we think about those sort of traverse valleys that come through the Côte, right? And bring in cooler air and different weather patterns as well. All right, let's talk about some Grands Crus. So the Premier Crus are so important though, because they're definitely going to be the more accessible of any of the wines that you might find coming out of Puligny, except for what comes from the village level, right? So Montrachet is 8 hectares. It straddles the border of 2 communes, both of which append their name, Puligny and Chassagne. Essentially, the split is half and half. 0.1 hectare more in Puligny, but who's counting? Probably Puligny. So technically, the Chassagne side should be known as Le Montrachet, but this is not usually actually followed by producers. They use the term fairly interchangeably. In Puligny, on this side, we're going to look at a map in a second, it's far less fragmented. You have a lot more growers on the Chassagne side than you do on the Puligny side. And a lot of the growers on the Puligny side sell their grapes to the larger negociant houses, or have the larger negociant houses make their wines for them. The first mention of the vineyard might have been in 1252, as it was mentioned as Montrachet and a gift to the Abbey of Mazières. In 1483, a rent book gave the first mention of grapes on the Chassagne side and noted that they were white grapes. Thomas Jefferson made note of the high price of Montrachet. Dr. Laval reckoned that there would be no price too high to pay for the wine in the mid-19th century. Dr. Laval was one of the first to really begin to study and classify the individual vineyards of Burgundy. And when we created the appellation system in the 1920s and the 1930s, a lot of the work that Laval had done was used for the classification of Burgundy as well. In 1921, court action was successfully taken against vignerons who were using the Montrachet name outside of the vineyard. And in 1931, the Comte de Moucheron, you might remember from our discussion in Gevrey-Chambertin, who was previously the owner of Clos Saint-Jacques, and they think because he got thrown out of a meeting about the Grands Crus because he was smoking a cigarette inside when they asked him not to, that his vineyard, Clos Saint-Jacques, was not upgraded to Grand Cru, right? So he did propose that all producers of Montrachet in 1931 should move to domain bottling. He wanted them to include their name and the name of their wine in both the bottle and the cork. He wanted a minimum price agreed upon for each vintage and a general agreement to declassify the wine in a poor vintage. But unfortunately, the proposal failed. But you can really see that leading up to the appellation system, the vineyard was really regarded as being one of the best, and they wanted to protect the name of Montrachet as well. Also embedded in a clutch of Grands Crus, which have appended the name of Montrachet to their own. We have centuries of glowing references, many of which we've listed. Abbé Arnaud in 1728 said, "This wine has qualities of which neither Latin nor French can explain the sweetness. I'm not able to express its delicacy and excellence." And it sits on this saddle, and this saddle is exposed to both the south and the east. And Montrachet essentially means something like shaven hill or like bald hill. So what really possessed the monk to use the site to plant the grapes, like we really don't know. You know, whatever insight that they might have had is lost today, but it really became one of the best places for growing Chardonnay. The very thin, marly limestone subsoil interspersed on the gentle slope. It is an impenetrable block of stone when it's young. It's monolithic. Jasper Morris and Alan Meadows say a minimum of 12 years of bottle age, a minimum, right? Like at the very, very least is what we should have for a bottle of Montrachet. Can you drink it younger? Of course you can, but they say it really needs time to develop that complexity in the bottle. So the white line is the dividing line between the Chassagne side to the left and the Puligny side to the right. And you can see the far fewer producers. Bouchard, Ramonet, the Bouillerotte de Chavigny sells his wine to, I think, 3 is Favelet, Jadot, and Latour. I think he sells them to 3 of the negociants, and Lagriche, who sells his wine. The wines are made by Louis Jadot. Batard Montrachet, much larger, but also split almost entirely 50-50 by both Chassagne and Puligny. First mention of Batard goes back to 1746. And so now we get into kind of the idea of how are these vineyards named, right? And several variations do exist, but the local folklore talks about a medieval lord of Montrachet who had a bastard child as a result of a dalliance with a virgin. Is this true? I have no idea. But the story has been retold so many times about why these vineyards might be named the way that they are, that I think it does have a place of discussion to talk about the history of that. So it said 3.71 hectares in Puligny because the 11.86 hectares does include Bienvenue, which we're going to talk about in a second. Montrachet and Bienvenue and Batard have the same bedrock. Chevalier does not. But in both Batard and Bienvenue, the topsoil is much deeper. It's a lot heavier, especially as we get to the lower part of the vineyard where the water table is closer, right? So we see that classic Batard is almost always rich, full, powerful, sometimes heavy, if not in the right hand. And we do have a lot more producers that own plots within Batard Montrachet, Leflaive, one of the most important. Ramonet, probably one of my favorite Burgundy producers is Ramonet, mostly because of like just my history of getting to know Burgundy and it being one of the first wines that I tried, but they are also really fantastic. But we're going to talk about Ramonet next week because he's located in Chassagne. Bienvenue, the welcome bastard of Montrachet, building on the legend, could be a reference to the vineyard. Building on the legend was that the Lord had a fondness for his bastard son, but it could also be a reference to the vineyard workers who would come from far away during the harvest, known as the welcome les bienvenus. The Abbey of Mazières mentioned the purchase of welcome vines in 1397 and 1418, which we think was a reference to this vineyard. It's been disputed, but it's thought that in the past, the entire vineyard was planted with Gamay and Pinot Noir, but it was specified as a white wine by Dr. Laval's time in the 1800s. So many other leading sites in Puligny at this time were stipulated as red. It's not as good for red. Chassagne has some sites that are really fantastic for red wine. Marceau does, Blagny, the Blagny Premier Cru Rouge is more rare, but more acceptable there. The vineyard formed a rectangle in the northeast corner of Batard. Excuse me. And it's a little bit softer, slightly more supple, and a little bit more forward than what we might find in Batard itself, in Bienvenue. Leflaive, as I mentioned, Leflaive had vineyards in all of the Grands Crus here. Ramonet, again, important Bachelay, Ramonet, Favelet, the negociant. He does a really great opportunity, Favelet, to try Bienvenue and Batard next to each other because their 2 rows are also next to each other. So you really get to see maybe the difference between the kind of slightly softer style of Bienvenue and the fuller style of Batard, right? Which I think is pretty cool. Chevalier, the most senior of the Montrachet appendages, just upslope from Montrachet itself, perhaps named for the Lord of Montrachet's legitimate heir who fought as a knight or chevalier in the Crusades. So Latour and Jadot, the negociants, they have two sections that they own, and they label their section as Les Demoiselles in honor of 19th century proprietors. It was previously part of Les Cailleret Premier Cru before being upgraded to Chevalier Montrachet Grand Cru in 1974. Bouchard also bottled a separate lieu-dit called La Cabote. It's a small rectangle of vine just above their parcel of Montrachet. They claim that I think when they purchased the wines in something like 1838, when they purchased their parcel of Montrachet, that this parcel of La Cabote was included. They actually petitioned, they labeled their wine as Montrachet for quite some time. When that was challenged, they petitioned to have their section of La Cabote included with Montrachet, but they were actually denied, which is interesting because Burgundy's so focused on history. They were able to prove that it was purchased at the same time as they purchased their Montrachet piece of the vineyard. They were able to prove that they had previously sold the wine under the name of Montrachet, but they do bottle it as Chevalier Montrachet La Cabote, so a little bit of that separate style of bottling. In 1955, Domaine Chartron applied for a further small section of Cailleret to be upgraded to Chevalier Montrachet, and this was granted, except for a small section, which you saw in that cutout, where subsoil was also brought in from other areas of Cailleret. We have a little bit of an issue with this in Puligny. Contiguous with Montrachet, the style is still very different. It's higher up on the slope, cooler air. We have that shallower topsoil. And we do have this terracing, which is very uncommon because of the way that the slope goes uphill here. We see these different levels of terraces planted. So we have less depth of flavor, but this incredibly stony minerality to the wine here as well. You can see the different terraces. So here's Montrachet, the Bouchard parcel. This is the Chevalier Montrachet La Cabote that we were just discussing. And then you can see the different terraces that are planted of Chevalier, Chevalier Demoiselle. This is the not classified part. And then this is the upgraded part by Chartron of Chevalier Montrachet as well. And you can see here, this parcel owned by Bouchard, and then La Cabote Chevalier is just above it. Fun stuff. All right, we're going to talk about some producers, and then we'll enjoy our Friday evening. Many producers come from outside of Puligny to make the wine. We'll discuss some of them at the end. Lefebvre is the most important. The family's been in Puligny since 1717, but the domain was founded by Joseph. He passed away in 1953. Two of his sons took over. Vincent's son, Olivier, and his cousin, Anne-Claude Lefebvre, took over in, I think, the mid 1980s. Olivier left to work on his own project, his negociant project we'll talk about, and Anne-Claude assumed full responsibility in 1994. She did work with a lot of the Olivier's share of the vineyard, but he took those out from the domain in 2009 when he was able to. She was a fervent and influential advocate for environmentally sensitive farming, so biodynamics, organic. She passed away from cancer in 2015, and her nephew, Bryce de la Morandier, had taken over today. Her nephew, the great-grandson of Joseph, Pierre Moret, I have a bottle of right here. This is something we can talk about in a second. 1986 Petard Montrachet. You can see not been stored well by, this is what you don't want when you're looking to buy white Burgundy. A lot of olive in the top and a really deep kind of caramelized color, right? That's one of the reasons I wanted to show this to you. So Pierre Moret, her right-hand man until his retirement in 2008. So you look for the Moret wines, which can be kind of like the Lefebvre wines, right? Another one of those insider tips. So 7 years of experiments with organics and biodynamics, and they converted the entire domain to biodynamics in 1997. The wines are fermented and matured in barrel. They spend their second winter in stainless steel tanks. Why is this important? Because it tells us a little bit about the character of the wine we can expect because of the winemaking. They make a Chevalier-Montrachet Grand Cru. It's a very chiseled version from 3 plot planted between 1955 and 1980. They make a Batard-Montrachet. Chevalier is probably one of the most accessible versions of a Montrachet Grand Cru appendage when it's younger. You can drink Chevalier when it's younger, although it still, I think, is probably at its best 10 to 15 years in. They make Batard Montrachet Grand Cru, 4 separate plots, 2 in Puligny, 2 in Chassagne, but because they share that vineyard, it can still be labeled as Batard Montrachet. It's concentrated, it's intense, it has richness of flavor, need time to develop. They make Beyond Renew. These are old vines planted in 1958 and 59. Really contribute to this wine's quality. It has a very sensual bouquet than the more powerful Batard. It's more exceptional in its grace. Their Premier Cru Les Parcels is considered to be one of the finest examples of Burgundy, a combination of very intense floral elegance and a lot of sort of nervous tension to the wine. Again, that minerality that sort of runs down the core of the palate when you have a drink. Premier Cru Les Combettes, the richer style that's closer to the border with Marceau. Old vine planted in 63 and 72, takes a little bit of time to open up. This is a good tip. Why is that? Because if you go out to dinner and you're thinking, I want to spend the money on ordering this Le Fleuve Premier Cru Les Combettes, you want to know that you're going to be there for a while. If you're catching a Broadway show and you have 1 hour, that's not the time to open up your Les Combettes, right? You want to think about those dinners where you have time to open it, and maybe you order something else, like a bottle of champagne, while you're waiting for that wine to reach its peak in the glass. Clavillon, really important as well. They own most of the vineyard, so you'll see quite a bit of Clavillon from Le Fleuve available in the market as well. Etienne Sauzet, another family-owned winery. Etienne put together a domain of around 12 hectares and established the Sauzet name as one of the very top in the village. His son-in-law took over in 1974, and then his 3 grandchildren split that inheritance amongst themselves in 1991. So Jean-Marc Boyot, which we've talked about quite a bit today, took his share of his vineyard and started his own project, considered, I think, to be one of the best producers in Puligny as well. And Girard also makes wine now, along with his daughter Emily and his son-in-law Benoit. And they augment their holdings, so they do purchase some grapes. So you'll see like Sarl Sauzet, and then you'll see Etienne Sauzet, which is made entirely from the vineyard that they do own. But all of the Sarl Sauzet wines are made exclusively from grapes they purchased from other family members or very close family friends and contracts. So they're really controlling the production of those grapes, even though they know how well the grapes are grown, even though they're not doing it themselves. Also a biodynamic estate since 2010. We see a little bit more new oak on these wines, 20 to 33% usually for the Premier Crus, maybe around 40% for some of the Grand Crus. Beyond Renew Batard, we are in Les Combettes. We're in Premier Cru Les Foletières, Champ Cadet. I have personally had the Les Combettes from 1995. I enjoyed a bottle as not really a gift. I bought it for myself with some friends, but enjoyed a bottle as a reward for finishing my WSET diploma at Noble Rot in London. And the wine was stunning. And it was actually, I was very happy that it was good because I was afraid 1995, 96, and 97 are some of the worst years for pre-mox in Burgundy, premature oxidation, some issues that happen with the white wines of Burgundy where bad corks may have been exposing weaknesses in the wines and the way that the wines were being produced. So there's been a lot, nobody really 100% understands exactly what causes it. But you will want to be careful of prematurely oxidized wines coming from Burgundy. Louis Carillon, the estate had been split up between his 2 children. So you'll see Jacques and Francois Carillon. So they made wine at their father's estate when they took over until 2009. But then in 2010, they split ways. So you'll still see Carillon, Louis Carillon wines in the market if they're prior to 2009 or before. But post 2009, you'll see Jacques Carillon or Francois Carillon. I think that people oftentimes prefer the wine coming from Jacques. He kept referred Champconnet, Bienvenue, and Francois kept Combat, and the remaining vineyard they still share. Jean Chartron, we talked about quite a bit today. Kind of has suffered from an association with a negociant project that was dissolved in 2004 and sold off, unfortunately. Jean Chartron makes really fantastic wine. He has great holding, Chevalier, the Clos des Chevaliers, that walled part of the Chevalier Grand Cru, Batard, Clos du Cailleret, another walled area within Premier Cru Cailleret, Pucelles for Latière, and he makes a Puligny-Montrachet Village style wine as well. Chateau de Puligny-Montrachet. So this is a really interesting estate. It's changed hands a lot since 1941. It was cared for a long time by the sharecropper Stefan Moroslavak, who you've seen that name already tonight too. And he wanted to buy it, but the sale to him was actually, family was from Poland, and the sale to Moroslavak was blocked by occupying Germans just before just during World War I, when he wanted to purchase it in World War II, when he wanted to purchase it in 1941. So they vetoed the sale. They wanted it to go to the mayor of Saint-Romain. In 1986, he sold it to Michel Laroche of Chablis, who really built a grand Chablis house, built it up really big and then sold it. Now he makes wine called Domaine d'Henri, which is really fantastic. Michel Laroche coming out of Chablis. And then it was owned by a Paris-based bank. So the bank appointed, the vineyard were not doing this great during this time. The wine was not made that well. They appointed Etienne de Monti as the general manager in 2001. He drastically reduced yields. He converted the vineyard to organic and biodynamic techniques. And today they own it. So they purchased it, I think I want to say like 2010, and they began releasing the wine under their own name in 2017. So anything between 10 and 17 is made by Etienne, and possibly even before that, since he was working for the winery too. So it's a great opportunity. It doesn't have the Monti name, so it's less expensive. But they also make Les Montrachet Grand Cru, Chevalier Montrachet, Batard Montrachet. Just think about all of these wines that you might get for cheaper than having Des Monti on the label that are made by the same winemaker. Their Puligny Village level wine, which is now the wine that you're going to taste tonight, is coming from that declassified site of Chalamu that we're going to discuss. Alain and Jean-Louis Chavy and their brother, and their cousin Philippe Chavy, all important within Puligny as well. Olivier Leflevre, cousin to Anne Claude, left Domaine Leflevre in 1994 to work with his negociant business that he started in 1985. He really wanted to kind of play and work with fruit from outside of the village of Puligny, since Leflevre really worked just within Puligny. But even though it's a negociant, he really controlled the production of his wine. All of the wine is vinified at the property from grapes that they purchased or juice that they purchased to make wine. He makes about 70,000 cases. So kind of negociant definitely across 65 appellations, but not as large as some of the others. Most of the production that he produces is white wine. And he does have his own vineyards in Puligny, Chassagne, and Meursault. So if you see Récolte du Domaine on the label, those are from his own vineyards as well. And his style is really elegant, finesse. They don't use a lot of new oak, but the wines are generally attractive when they're younger, which is something I really enjoy as well. Vincent Garradine purchased the Henri Clerc vineyard, but you'll still see some of these bottlings as well. Benoit Ent, brother to Arnaud Ent in Meursault, picks on the early side, doesn't use a lot of new oak. They tend to be very terroir, pure expressions of Puligny, Moros-Slovak, 2 domains, one of the late sharecropper Stefan, and then one of his son as well that you'll see. They have plots of Puligny, Meursault, Chassagne, and Saint-Aubin as well. Paul Pernod, really notable producer. They have pretty sizable holdings, but a lot of their wines, as we mentioned before, remained under contract to negotiant houses like Joseph Drouin. I would imagine that as those contracts are up, we're going to see the Pernod family producing more of the wine coming from their own vineyard. 15 of their 20 hectares are located in Puligny, so that is quite a bit. Paul and Michael and grandson Paul are now also all working with the family business. The wines have been traditionally a little bit more weighty and sometimes rustic, but we're really seeing a lot of improvement here. They have a lot of Premier Crus as well as some Grand Crus as well, Batard, Bienvenue. Jean-Marc Boyot, coming from outside the village, but make great wines here, Premier Cru, Champcadet, Combet, Refert, Henri Boyot, Claude Lamouchère that we mentioned, and Perrier. Arnaud Ant makes wine in Les Referts, coming from Meursault. Jean-Philippe Fichet, also in Refert. Thierry Mautrat in Chalamu. Dominique Lafon, also coming from Meursault, making wine in Champagne. Les Demoiselles, owned entirely by Chassagne producers. Guy Amiot, and this is the Premier Cru of Les Demoiselles. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. Guy Amiot, Colline Deleger, Michael Picard. Premier Cru Cailleret, we have Domaine des Montis, coming from Volnay, Claude Lambray. Joseph Durhin, Louis Jadot are both very, very strong in Puligny. And Favely, within the past decade, 15 years or so, acquired Domaine Monod and has really improved its holdings and is making a lot of the wines from those previous holdings too. Sorry to keep everybody late. There's really a lot to cover in these classes, and I know that we try to go quickly, but thank you for sticking it out with us. We really appreciate it. So we have 2 wines that we're featuring this evening. I don't have either of these to taste along with you, but I really, truly hope that you enjoy them. I think that they're wines that do benefit from being at the right temperature and from having some time to open up. If these are wines that you want to cellar, you can certainly do so as well. So the first, Domaine des Montis. So we've talked a little bit about them. They're based in Volnay, one of Burgundy's most iconic estates dating back to the 1700s. So the family is lawyers. They've been lawyers forever. Hubert des Montis is kind of the patriarch, took over in 1947 with just 2.5 hectares. So the family actually has an incredibly long history dating back to the 1730s of producing wine. But they lost, they lost a lot of plots. They used to own parcels of Moussigny. They used to own parcels of what else did they have? I can't remember at the moment. But they owned a lot of parcels in more of the Grands Crus and a lot of the Premier Crus. But they were forced to sell through a lot of the hardships of the 19th and the 20th century as well. So Etienne and Alex, brother and sister, returned to the family business. They've also both worked in law and banking. All of their estate vineyards are farmed biodynamically. I think Alex is married to Jean-Marc Rouleau of Meursault. I could be wrong about that, but it's ringing a bell right now. And Etienne had been carefully acquiring parcels in the best Burgundy vineyards for the domain for quite some time now. So they're really building back up their holdings in the best vineyards within Burgundy. As we mentioned, he purchased Chateau de Puligny in 2012. Since 2017, the wines are released under the Monti name, so you won't see them at Chateau de Puligny anymore. Now, this particular wine, 75% of these grapes are coming from the declassified section of the Premier Cru of Chalamu. Now, remember, we talked about this, right? The owner brought in topsoil from somewhere else, and I think I had it as 1977 in the previous slide, but sometimes history gets the date change in the retelling. But 1975 or 1977, the previous owner brought in topsoil from elsewhere. The plot was declassified, But essentially that topsoil had really eroded. And although the vineyard plot itself had not been upgraded to Premier Cru yet, and I don't know if that's because Etienne hasn't petitioned for that to happen, or if they've said no, but he really believed that the site had returned to its original terroir. He doesn't think that anything remains of that 20 centimeters of topsoil that was brought here in the mid 1970s. So the remaining part, 25% of the grape do come from village level vineyard within Puligny-Montrachet. But here you have the opportunity, we're talking about drinking pretty much Premier Cru Burgundy right here, coming from Puligny, right? Fermented in demi-muid, so much larger wood barrels, not as small as something like Barrique, aged 1 year in these demi-muids as well, and then another 5 months in stainless steel. These wines always have a lot of tension, which I really love. I haven't tried this particular vintage that you're drinking right now, but in general, they always have a sense of power with refinement, which is also really one of the breeds, right? One of the markers, the hallmark, the benchmarks of Puligny itself. 2018 was a fairly hot summer, 15, 16, 17, 18 warmer years, although with some erratic hail and other vineyard issues. The grapes were picked fairly early, so they tend to produce these really crisp wines. They might have a little bit less concentration. I think that they're probably wines that are for slightly younger drinking, but something like this I think could easily probably go 10 years and be great in the bottle if it's stored correctly. Don't store it like this. The second wine, Antonin Guyon. So this is Premier Cru Les Parcels, coming from 2012. Also a producer located from outside of Puligny-Montrachet. They're one of the largest family-owned wineries in the Côte d'Or, founded in the 1960s. The smaller the production, the more prestigious the winery. The less wine they make overall, usually the higher the price, right? So sometimes we really do have to look for the producers that are outside of appellation that produce more wine and are able to offer more value because they have more to sell. It can be really important. In fact, the only time I've ever had any of the Grand Cru Puligny-Montrachet vineyards have been from Louis Jadot because I can't afford. And I actually didn't even buy those ones. They were left over from somebody that did a Burgundy, a Jadot dinner. So I got to try it. A lot of 1990 Jadot coming from Puligny-Montrachet. And it was a really fantastic experience. But we don't all get to do that, as we mentioned. We talk a lot about these Grand Crus without maybe always the opportunity to taste them, right? But they do produce a really exceptional range of Premier Cru and Grand Crus here. Only 3 barrels of this wine are produced. It is a tiny, tiny parcel within Les Parcels, again, the maiden. It is fermented in oak. It is aged a little bit longer. They're outside of Puligny. They have the space to be able to do so. So aged for 15 months in French oak here. Twice weekly stirring, creating that richer style on the palate, right? 2012 was a very low volume year, especially for Chardonnay. There was very erratic and challenging weather conditions, but what fruit there was really was considered to produce exceptional wine. So if these 2012s have been stored well, they really should be at kind of moving into approaching their peak right now, right? They might even be able to go a little bit longer. And what you get with Puligny-Montrachet that is approaching its peak is that when it gets there, it can also hold for an incredibly long time. It won't lose a lot of its freshness and flavor very quickly. So I really think that this should be in a place where you have mature white Burgundy and we have flavors of mushroom and truffle and earth and kind of really great expensive French butter on the palate. We're beginning to see sort of this dried sort of white pineapple and tropical fruit, because you do get a ripeness of fruit in Puligny along with that minerality, but you'll still have that core of tension down the center of the palate. And I'd love to hear what you guys think about this wine once you have the opportunity to try it. The last thing I just wanted to leave you with talking about this bottle. So this was not something that I paid for. It was kind of given away because it was stored incorrectly. So if you're thinking about buying Burgundy, I mentioned before, this is what you do not want. You don't want all of this ullage or this bottle space, because this is creating this opportunity for oxidation within the bottle. I don't know how well you can see, but I mean, the color is quite deep. It's almost kind of a brown caramelized sort of toffee color to the wine. 1986, Puligny-Montrachet Grand Cru, coming from Pierre Moret, again, and Claude Leflevre's right-hand man at Domaine Leflevre. I'm going to open this someday. Now, I've also stored this terribly because I brought it home over a year ago. I was going to keep it, open it up and just sort of see what the wine was like. And it's just been sitting upright in my fridge for the past year. But someday I wouldn't have treated it that way if this was a bottle of wine that I had paid for, especially of this caliber. And if it had looked like it was in good condition then, but it didn't. But someday I'm just going to open it up and find out what's going on with that, because no reason not to. It might go down the drain, but it might also surprise us. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening, and we'll see you next week for Chassagne. Have a great night.